I mentioned tolerance earlier, but let's talk about the mechanism for tolerance. How tolerance actually happens in the brain. Well, we talked about what it is. It's that upon repeated administration, you need higher and higher doses to reach the same effect. This goes back to a concept we talked about earlier, balance. In this case, the brain needs a certain level of stimulation. And if the brain is overstimulated, as it is when we take drugs, the brain will take steps to protect itself because excitotoxicity, toxicity caused by overexcitation, damages and kills neurons. So, to prevent excitotoxicity, the brain has to do something to reduce this stimulation. So, let's look at our synapse. And this is a synapse in the reward system. This is the system that makes you feel pleasure whenever you feel pleasure, whether it's from food, sex, sleep, money, love, acceptance. What else makes you feel good? You make your list. Whatever it is, it's because of the reward system activation. Now, we have a reward system so that we keep eating, procreating, sleeping, uh, so that we keep doing all the things that we need to do to keep our species alive and to keep ourselves motivated and functioning. So, let me give you an example. Here are my dopamine receptors. I come home. Well, now I never leave home, but let's pretend like I do. I come home and I see my kids. Hi, Dad, let's wrestle. Uh, that causes release of dopamine. That activates some of my dopamine receptors, and I feel good. I feel happy. This is rewarding. Now, let's say I discover our old friend heroin, and I take heroin. What's that going to do to my reward system? Bombard the heck out of it. Bombard it like it's never been bombarded. Now, what will the brain do to compensate for this overstimulation? It does really the only thing that it can do. It resorbs, devours these receptors. I hope this is intuitive why going from 3 receptors to 2 would make you less sensitive to the rewarding neurotransmitter. If that's not intuitive, let's talk about it during discussion. Now, the brain reduced receptors. Ah, feeling better, safe from excitotoxicity. But I discovered heroin. So what am I going to do? I'm going to take more. Boom, 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 to reach the same effect. And what's the brain going to do? Devour more receptors. So as addiction develops, this is the brain you're left with. A depleted brain that has a lot of trouble feeling pleasure. Now, heroin will still give you enough stimulation to feel normal, But in later addiction, the highs are nowhere near the same. But here's a bigger problem. Here's my depleted synapse with one lonely receptor. And I come home from a day of heroining, and my kids come up to me, and I feel nothing. The normal pleasures of life, which used to give me plenty of stimulation, now with a depleted reward system, these give me nothing. Early addiction is motivated by reward. Late addiction is motivated by remove suffering. If you recall from Psych 1, this is positive reinforcement. What is this? Negative reinforcement. They're both reinforcing and they both keep the person using, but the motivation is very different. Here, you're getting high and partying. Here, you're trying to not feel like you're constantly dying. Let's talk about withdrawal. Withdrawal is a state that you go into as soon as the last dose you administered wears off. And the specifics of the withdrawal are always the opposite of the drug effects. So, opiates reduce pain. If you're withdrawing from them, you hurt. Opiates reduce anxiety. When you're off of them in withdrawal, you're extremely anxious. Remember, I told you opiates were used for diarrhea? Well, when you get off of them, you have horrible D and vomiting, and so on and so forth. All the effects of the drug. By the way, cannabis. What are the effects of cannabis? We could say relaxing, appetite, sleep. What does withdrawal look like? Anxious, no appetite, you're not sleeping. Finally, before we move on, let me mention sensitization. This is strange. Now, it doesn't really, we know it happens, but we don't understand how it happens. This is where, upon repeated administration, the drug becomes more effective. Now, I have one story on this. Have you guys ever known someone who smoked a lot of cannabis and then stops? They just suddenly stop, and you ask why. And they'll say something like, man, it started making me anxious and paranoid, and it was bugging me. My heart was racing. I thought I was going to die. How many of you know these people? Usually in class, it's about 20%. I don't know for sure that that's sensitization, but it looks like it. It looks like it. And these folks will often try it one more time and then never again, or at least not for a few years. Again, I don't know that cannabis phenomenon is sensitization, but it certainly looks like it to me.